The whisper said my name. I was alone in the wax museum. Every figure was exactly where it should be, except one. On my first night shift, they gave me a list of rules. Simple things, like making sure the Duke always faces the door, like never responding to voices after midnight. I followed every rule. So when something moved, I knew it wasn't a mistake. This is what happens when you work the night shift at a historical wax museum. The Ashford Historical Wax Museum sits on the corner of 10th and Montgomery, a Victorian building that survived 2 world wars and countless attempts at modernization. During the day, it welcomes tourists eager to photograph themselves next to famous historical figures. At night, it becomes something else entirely, something that requires very specific people to watch over it, people desperate enough or foolish enough to ignore the warnings hidden in a job posting that promise above market wages for minimal interaction work. I was both desperate and foolish. My name is Jordan Hayes, and 6 months ago, I would have laughed at anyone who suggested the supernatural was real. I had a degree in art history, a mountain of student debt, and a series of failed gallery positions that left me scrambling for anything that would keep my apartment. When the posting appeared on an obscure job board, night custodian needed, historical museum, excellent pay, minimal public interaction required, I applied within minutes. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Helena Vance, the museum's director, a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Her office smelled of old paper and lavender, and the walls were covered with photographs of the museum's exhibits spanning decades. "The position is straightforward," she said, sliding a folder across her mahogany desk. "You will monitor the exhibits from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. You will ensure the building remains secure. You will follow a specific set of protocols." She paused, her gaze sharpening. "Without exception." I nodded, eager to please. "Of course. I'm very detail-oriented." "The protocols are not suggestions, Jordan. They are absolute requirements. If you cannot commit to following them precisely, this position is not for you." Her tone carried a weight that made the hair on my arm stand up, but I attributed it to her stern demeanor. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. "Not really. Not then." She opened a folder, revealing a single sheet of paper with type instructions. "Read these carefully. Memorize them before your first shift." I scanned the list, expecting standard security protocols about locking doors and checking windows. What I found instead made me pause. Night shift protocols, Ashford Historical Wax Museum. Upon beginning your shift, walk through all exhibits in order. Victorian-era, Revolutionary War, Medieval Court, Renaissance Gallery, Ancient Civilizations. Note the position of each figure in your log. The figure known as the Duke, Victorian-era, position 3, must always face the main entrance door. If you find him facing any other direction, adjust him immediately and note the time in your log. Do not turn your back on the following exhibits for longer than 30 seconds. The Executioner, Medieval Court. The Plague Doctor, Victorian-era, position 7. The Oracle, Ancient Civilizations, position 2. After midnight, you may hear whispers from the Sleeping Beauty display. Renaissance Gallery. Do not acknowledge them. Do not respond. Do not approach the display until after 12:30 a.m. If you hear footsteps that are not your own, continue your rounds as normal. Do not investigate. Do not call out. All figures must remain on their designated platforms. If you find a figure off its platform, radio for Mrs. Vance immediately. Do not attempt to return it yourself. The museum's grandfather clock chimes every hour. Count the chimes. If it chimes 13 times, leave the building immediately and wait in your vehicle until dawn. Keep all interior lights at 60% brightness. Full darkness invites attention. Full brightness disturbs rest. Your round should take exactly 45 minutes. Do not linger in any single area for more than 5 minutes. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it is. I looked up from the paper, searching Mrs. Vance's face for any sign that this was an elaborate joke. Her expression remained grave. "These seem unusual," I said carefully. "They are necessary," she replied. "This museum houses figures that were crafted with extraordinary care and detail. Some were made using techniques that are no longer practiced. Others incorporate materials that are historically significant. The preservation of these exhibits requires specific conditions. But the part about whispers and "do you want the position or not, Jordan?" Her interruption was sharp, but not unkind. "I will not waste your time or mine with explanations you won't believe until you experience them yourself. Either you can follow these protocols precisely, or you cannot. Which is it?" I thought about my dwindling bank account, the eviction notice I received last week, the humiliation of moving back to my parents' house in my late 20s. I thought about the salary she'd mentioned, nearly double what any other security position offered. "I can follow them," I said. "Good." She stood, signaling the end of our meeting. "Your first shift begins tonight at 10. Arrive 15 minutes early. I will walk you through the exhibits once before I leave. After that, you will be alone until the morning custodial staff arrives at 6. That evening, I returned to the museum with a thermos of coffee and a determination to prove myself professional despite the bizarre rules. The sun was setting as I arrived, painting the Victorian building in shades of orange and deep purple. Mrs. Vance met me at the employee entrance, a side door that led directly into a small office with security monitors and a desk. "Your station," she said, gesturing to setup. "The monitors cycle through each room every 30 seconds. Your radio is here. Use it only for emergencies or if you encounter a situation covered in the protocols. I am on call throughout the night." She handed me a leather-bound logbook and a pen. "Document everything. Every round, every adjustment, every unusual occurrence. The museum's history depends on accurate records." We began the walkthrough as the last daylight faded from the tall windows. The museum transformed in the dimming light, shadows pooling in corners and stretching across the marble floors. The first exhibit, Victorian-era, housed 12 figures in period dress arranged in a recreation of a London street scene. Ladies in bustles held parasols. Gentlemen in top hats appeared mid-conversation. And there, in position 3, stood the Duke. He was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. The figure wore an impeccably tailored coat with gold buttons, one hand resting on a silver-topped cane. His face was stern, with a prominent nose and deep-set eyes that seemed to follow our movement. Most unsettling was the quality of his skin. Whoever had crafted this figure had achieved a texture so realistic that I could see individual pores, the faint suggestion of stubble along his jaw, even the slight discoloration of old age spots on his hands. "He faces the door," Mrs. Vance said, positioning herself so I could see the angle. "Always, if he moves, correct him immediately." "How would he move?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. She didn't answer. Instead, she led me to the next exhibit, pointing out the plague doctor, a figure in a black cloak and bird-like mask that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Never turn your back on him for long," she reminded me. The medieval court was a grand space with vaulted ceilings and tapestries on the walls. The executioner stood on a raised platform, his massive frame clad in leather and chainmail, a cruel-looking axe resting against his shoulder. His face was covered by a black hood, but I could swear I felt his attention on me as we passed. The Renaissance gallery held elegant figures in elaborate dress, and at its center, behind a velvet rope, lay Sleeping Beauty. She reclined on a gilded bed, her hands folded peacefully over her chest, her face serene. She was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Too perfect, too peaceful, too much like death itself. "After midnight, do not acknowledge her," Mrs. Vance said, "no matter what you hear." Finally, we reached ancient civilizations, where figures in togas and Egyptian garb stood among replica columns and pyramids. The oracle occupied a throne-like chair, her painted eyes seeming to stare into some distant realm. Something about her made my skin crawl. "You understand protocols?" Mrs. Vance asked as we returned to the office. "Yes," I said, though my hands were trembling slightly as I took the logbook from her. "Then I will leave you to your first shift. Remember, Jordan, these rules exist for your protection. Follow them exactly." She paused at the door, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. "And do try to last longer than the previous custodian. Training replacements is exhausting." Before I could ask what happened to previous custodian, She was gone, her footsteps echoing through the empty museum until the sound of the front door closing signaled that I was truly alone. I sat at the desk, staring at the monitors. The figures looked back at me through the black and white feeds, frozen in their eternal poses. I opened the logbook and wrote my first entry. 10:15 p.m., shift begun. All figures in correct positions. Duke facing door. The clock on the wall ticked forward. The building settled into its nighttime sounds. The creak of old wood, the whisper of air through vents, the distant hum of climate control systems. I sipped my coffee and told myself this was just a job, an easy job, a well-paying job, watching over wax figures that couldn't possibly move. At 11 p.m., I began my first round. The hallways felt longer at night, the pools of 60% lighting creating more shadows and illumination. I walked through the Victorian-era first, checking each figure against my mental inventory. All present, all correct. The Duke faced the door, his stern expression unchanged. I moved through the Revolutionary War exhibit, past founding fathers frozen in debate, through medieval court, carefully noting the 30-second rule as I passed the executioner. The Renaissance gallery seemed peaceful, Sleeping Beauty undisturbed in her eternal rest. I was beginning to relax, to feel foolish for my earlier nervousness, when I entered ancient civilizations. The oracle had moved. Not much, just a slight turn of her head, a subtle shift in the angle of her painted gaze. But enough. Enough that I knew, with absolute certainty, that she was not facing the same direction as before. My heart began to pound. I checked my watch, 11:43 p.m. I pulled out the protocols, scanning them again. If you find a figure off its platform, radio from Mrs. Vance immediately. But she wasn't off her platform. She had just moved. I stood there, frozen myself, staring at the figure. Had I been wrong during the walkthrough? Had I simply misremembered her exact position? The logical part of my brain insisted this must be the case. The deeper, more primitive part of my brain was screaming that something was very wrong. I decided to note it in the logbook and continue my rounds. As I turned to leave, I could have sworn, though I'll never be certain, that I heard a soft sigh echo through the exhibition hall, the sound of ancient breath, released from ancient lungs. I walked faster than protocol demanded back to the office, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty museum. I wrote the entry with shaking hands. 11:45 p.m., round completed. All figures present. Oracle position possibly shifted. On the monitors, everything appeared normal. The Duke faces door. The plague doctor stood in his shadow corner. Sleeping Beauty lay in peaceful repose. The Oracle sat on her throne, exactly as I'd left her. Exactly as I'd left her. The clock struck midnight. 12 deep chimes that resonated through the building. I counted each one carefully, almost holding my breath as I waited for a 13th that never came. Then, in the silence that followed, I heard it, a whisper, soft as silk, quiet as a sigh, but unmistakably there. It drifted through the museum's halls, carried on air that should have been still. Jordan, my name. It knew my name. Every instinct told me to investigate, to find the source, to prove to myself that it was just pipes or ventilation or some rational explanation. But the protocols were clear. After midnight, you may hear whispers from the Sleeping Beauty display. Do not acknowledge them. Do not respond. Do not approach the display until after 12:30 a.m. I sat at the desk, hands gripped tight around my coffee thermos, and forced myself to stare at the monitors. On the screen showing the Renaissance gallery, Sleeping Beauty remained motionless on her bed. But the whispers continued. Jordan, come closer. I've been waiting for you. The voice was beautiful and terrible, promising and threatening, familiar and utterly alien. It wound through my thoughts like smoke, making it hard to concentrate on anything else. I checked my watch obsessively. 12:03 a.m. 27 minutes until I could safely approach that gallery. 27 minutes of listening to my name spoken by something that should not be able to speak. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. The whispers came in waves, sometimes urgent, sometimes pleading, always using my name with intimacy that made my skin crawl. I began to understand why the previous custodian might have left. At 12:30 a.m. exactly, the whisper stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than sound. I waited another 5 minutes, gathering my courage, before beginning my second round. Everything seemed normal as I walked through the exhibits, until I reached the Victorian-era. The Duke was facing the wrong direction. He stood in his position, immaculate in his finery, but now he faced the interior of the exhibit rather than the door. His painted eyes, which I could have sworn were brown, now seemed almost black in the dim light. Protocol demanded I correct him immediately. I approached slowly, my hands sweating despite the climate-controlled air. Up close, the craftsmanship was even more remarkable and more disturbing. The wax of his face held such detail that I could see the faint suggestion of veins beneath the surface. His hair looked real, each strand perfectly placed. His clothes were authentic period pieces, not costumes. I reached out to grip his shoulders and turn him, and the wax was warm, not room temperature, not even body temperature. Warm, like something living had been wearing the skin. I jumped back with a gasp, my heart hammering in my chest. The Duke remained motionless, but now I could see, or imagine I could see, the faintest rise and fall of his chest, as if he were breathing. "Turn him," I whispered to myself. "Just turn him and log it and finish your shift." I forced myself forward, grabbed the figure with both hands, and rotated him back to face the door. The wax was still warm, still disturbingly flesh-like under my fingers. As I adjusted his final position, his head tilted slightly, and for one heart-stopping moment, his eyes seemed to focus directly on mine. Then he was still again, properly positioned, just another wax figure. I retreated to the office and logged the incident, my handwriting barely legible. 12:47 a.m., Duke found facing interior, corrected the face door, figure temperature abnormal. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and coffee. I completed my rounds exactly as specified, noting the executioner's unnerving presence, the plague doctor's shadow that seemed too large a light source, the oracle's knowing smile that I didn't remember from before. Each time I returned to the office, I half expected to find something waiting for me, but the monitor showed only empty halls and frozen figures. At 5:30 a.m., as dawn began to paint the sky outside, the museum felt different. The oppressive weight I hadn't fully noticed lifted slightly. The figures seemed less alive, more like what they were supposed to be, wax and paint and clever construction. When Mrs. Vance arrived at 6:15 a.m., I was exhausted but intact. She reviewed my logbook with an inscrutable expression. "The Duke moved," she noted. "Yes." I corrected him as instructed. "And the whispers?" I didn't respond. She looked up at me, and for the first time, something like approval flickered across her face. "You follow the protocols. That's good. Many don't make it through their first night with that much discipline. What happened to the last custodian?" I asked. Mrs. Vance closed the logbook. "He broke protocol." He responded to the whispers. She stood, gathering her things. "You did well, Jordan. Same time tonight." I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain screamed that I should walk out and never return. But I thought about my bills, my pride, and the strange, terrible curiosity that had taken root in my mind. "Yes," I said, "same time tonight." As I walked out into the morning sunlight, I glanced back at the museum. In one of the upper windows, I could have sworn I saw a figure watching me. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there, just shadows and glass, and the promise of another night to come. My second night began with an email I discovered when I checked my phone during dinner, a message from an address I didn't recognize, museum.archives.1847 at ashfordhistorical.org. The subject line read simply, "For the night custodian." The body of the email contained a single scanned document, a newspaper clipping from 1923, yellowed and barely legible. I zoomed in, squinting at the text. "Tragedy at Ashford Wax Museum. Night watchman found deceased." Local authorities responded to the Ashford Historical Wax Museum early Tuesday morning after the night watchman, Mr. Theodore Walsh, age 52, Failed to report the end of his shift. Mr. Walsh was discovered in the Renaissance Gallery, deceased from apparent heart failure. Witnesses report his face was frozen in an expression of extreme terror. The museum's director, Miss Catherine Ashford, stated that Mr. Walsh had been employed for only 3 weeks and had recently complained of unusual disturbances during his night duties. An investigation is pending, though authorities suspect natural causes. The article continued, but my eyes caught on one final line. This marks the 3rd death of a night employee at the museum since its founding in 1847. I should have read that as a warning. Instead, I read it as confirmation that something rare was happening in that building, something beyond rational explanation, and perversely, that made me want to understand it more. I arrived at the museum at 9:45 p.m. The email's still open on my phone. Mrs. Vance was waiting in the office, but tonight she wasn't alone. A younger woman stood beside her, perhaps in her 30s, with sharp features and darker hair pulled back in professional bun. "Jordan, this is Dr. Elizabeth Cormier," Mrs. Vance introduced. "She's a historian specializing in Victorian funerary practices and preservation techniques. She consults with the museum periodically." Dr. Cormier extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm cool. "Mrs. Vance tells me you survived your first night. That puts you ahead of the last 3 candidates." 3. I repeated. "The position has proven difficult to fill," Dr. Cormier said with a tight smile. "Most people lack the discipline required. They either break protocol or simply don't return for a second shift." Mrs. Vance interjected smoothly. "Dr. Cormier will be conducting research in the archives tonight. She has full access to the museum, but she will remain in the basement level. You should not encounter her during your rounds." The basement? I hadn't known there was a basement. "The archives," Dr. Cormier corrected. "Original records, acquisition documents, correspondence from the museum's founders. Fascinating material, if you appreciate history." Her eyes held mine for a moment too long. Some of the preservation techniques used on the older figures are quite extraordinary. Lost arts, you might say. Something about her phrasing sent a chill down my spine. But before I could respond, Mrs. Vance was already ushering her toward a door I'd assumed was a closet. It opened to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Don't let us keep you," Mrs. Vance said to me. "Your shift begins in 10 minutes. They disappeared down the stairs, and I was alone with the monitors and the logbook and the growing certainty that I was missing crucial pieces of a very disturbing puzzle. At 10 p.m., I began my first round. The Victorian-era appeared unchanged. The Duke faced his door, his expression stern as always, though I could have sworn his eyes followed me more obviously tonight. I kept my distance, not wanting to feel that disturbingly warm wax again. The Revolutionary War exhibit was quiet. The medieval court loomed with its usual menace. I made sure not to turn my back on the executioner for more than 30 seconds, counting silently as I documented the exhibit in my log. The Renaissance Gallery made my breath catch. Sleeping Beauty looked different tonight. Her position was the same, her hands still folded across her chest, her expression still serene. But there was something changed about her face, a slight tension around her eyes, perhaps, or a subtle tightening of her lips. She looked less peacefully asleep and more forcefully restrained. I checked my watch. 10:38 p.m. I had more than an hour before the whispers would begin. I forced myself to move on to ancient civilizations. The oracle sat on a throne, her painted eyes fixed on some distant point. But tonight, on the floor beside her platform, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small brass plaque, tarnished with age. I knelt to read it. The oracle, crafted 1847 by master artisan E. Ashford. Materials: beeswax, pigments, human hair, and other substances of historical significance. Other substances of historical significance. The phrasing was deliberately vague, designed to avoid some uncomfortable truth. I thought about Dr. Cormier's comment about lost arts and felt my stomach turn. I completed my round and returned to the office at 10:52 p.m., logging everything as required. On the monitors, I could occasionally see a light moving in the archives. Dr. Cormier at work, presumably. Otherwise, The museum was still. At 11:30 p.m., during my second round, I found the first figure out of place. Not off its platform entirely, but definitely moved. One of the Revolutionary War figures, a soldier in a Continental Army uniform, had shifted position. He now faced slightly toward the wall, rather than toward the center of the display. His musket, which should have been resting against his shoulder, was now gripped in both hands, pointed forward as if ready to fire. The protocol said to radio Mrs. Vance only if a figure was off its platform. This didn't qualify, technically, but the change was undeniable. I approached cautiously, noting details. The soldier's face was young, maybe early 20s if he'd been real. His expression was one of determination mixed with fear, the face of someone going into battle. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, too extraordinary. Without thinking, I reached out to adjust the position. The moment my fingers touched the wax uniform, I felt it, a pulse, faint but unmistakable, a heartbeat under my palm. I jerked my hand back, stumbling against a velvet rope that separated visitors from the exhibit. The soldier remained frozen, but I couldn't unsee what I felt, couldn't unfeel it. I ran back to the office, my breath coming in short gasps. I grabbed the radio, ready to call Mrs. Vance, then stopped. What would I say? That I felt a heartbeat in a wax figure? That something impossible was happening? I pulled out my phone instead and researched Victorian wax figures and lifelike sculptures and preservation techniques 1800s. What I found made my blood run cold. Victorian artisans were obsessed with creating perfect representations of the dead. They used death masks, real hair, sometimes even preserved skin stretched over wax forms. The most extreme practitioners incorporated actual human remains into their works, bone structures to provide authentic skeletal support, teeth for realistic mouths, eyes from donors or corpses. But surely that was rare. Surely modern museums would never display such things. Except the Asher Museum had been operating since 1847, during the height of that obsession, and the figures here weren't labeled as reproductions. They were labeled as historical artifacts in themselves. At midnight, the clock chimed 12 times. I counted each one carefully. Then the whispers began. "Jordan, you felt it, didn't you? You know now, come closer." The voice was clearer tonight, more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the office even to the closed door. "Jordan, we've been waiting. So many years waiting. You can help us." I clenched my jaw and focused on the monitors. On the screen showing the Renaissance gallery, Sleeping Beauty remained motionless. But as I watched, her fingers twitched. Just once. Just barely. But they moved. You saw that. The whisper came, almost triumphant. "You see us now. You know we're here." I grabbed the protocols, scanning them desperately for any instruction I'd missed, any guidance for what to do when the figures actively moved while you watched. But there was nothing, just the same rules, the same warnings. Do not acknowledge the whispers. "Jordan, please, it's so cold here, so dark, let's out." The voice shifted, becoming younger, more desperate. I realized with creeping horror that it wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping and echoing. Multiple whispers, multiple pleas, all using my name. My hands shook as I logged the time. 12:07 a.m. 23 more minutes until I could safely enter that gallery. 23 minutes of listening to the dead, because that's what they were, I was certain now. Beg for release. At 12:15 a.m., the Duke appeared on a different monitor. I did a double take, checking the rotation. The Victorian-era camera showed his position clearly, exactly where he should be, facing the door. But now, he also appeared in the frame for the medieval court camera, standing in the archway between exhibits. That was impossible. The same figure couldn't be in two places. Unless there were two of him. Unless he had moved and left something in his original position. Or unless he could somehow exist in multiple locations at once. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, breaking apart. The rules keep us bound, but the rules are weakening. You feel it. The museum remembers. I watched the monitors obsessively. The Duke in the Victorian era remained perfectly still. The Duke in the medieval court archway turned his head slowly, scanning the room as if searching for something. At 12:30 a.m. exactly, the whispers stopped, and I heard footsteps, not my own, coming from above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the ceiling, moving from one gallery to another. The protocol said, if you hear footsteps that are not your own, continue your rounds as normal. Do not investigate. Do not call out. But I had to know. I had to see. I left the office and moved toward the Renaissance Gallery, my flashlight cutting through the dim lighting. The footsteps continued above me, matching my pace, as if something was following my progress from the floor above. When I reached the gallery, Sleeping Beauty was sitting up, not off her platform, not standing, but sitting upright in her bed, her hands now at her sides, her eyes, which had been peacefully closed, now open and staring directly at me. Her eyes were not painted. They were real human eyes, brown and wet, and filled with desperate awareness. You came, she whispered, her lips barely moving. You actually came. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, locked in place by the impossibility before me. Please, she continued, her voice soft and broken. Please understand. We didn't choose this. Master Ashford promised us immortality. He promised our legacy would live forever. He didn't tell us it would be like this. Trapped, aware, unable to move except when the rules weaken. Were you? I managed to ask. What we were, she said. What remains? He used our bodies, our essence, to create his perfect figures. We are the museum, Jordan. We are what makes it historical. Real people, preserved in wax and ritual, unable to die, unable to live. The footsteps above us stopped. Sleeping Beauty's gaze flickered to the ceiling. He's listening. Master Ashford. He's always here, making sure we don't break free. The rules are his rules. They keep us bound to our platforms, limit our awareness. But you, her eyes refocused on me with painful intensity. You're the first custodian in years who's followed them perfectly. The rules don't work as well when someone obeys them completely. They were designed to be broken, to give him reason to tighten the bindings. That's insane, I said, but even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't. The Duke moves first because he was the first. He has the most freedom, she continued rapidly, as if running out of time. The Oracle speaks in prophecy because that's all she can manage. The executioner can only express rage because that's what he died feeling. We are fragments, Jordan, pieces of people trapped in monuments to a madman's vision of preservation. A door slammed somewhere in the building. Heavy footsteps began descending a staircase. He's coming, Sleeping Beauty whispered, terror crossing her too real face. He knows I've spoken. You have to go. Follow the protocols exactly. Don't break them. But don't let him know you understand. You're our only hope. Hope for what? I asked desperately. The 13th chime, she said as she began to slowly recline back into her sleeping position. It's not a warning. It's an invitation. When the clock chimes 13, the bindings break completely. For one moment, we could be free. But only if someone is there to witness it. Only if someone chooses to acknowledge what we are. Her eyes closed. Her hands folded back across her chest. Within seconds, she looked exactly as she had when I'd first seen her. Peaceful, serene, perfectly preserved. But I had seen her move, heard her speak, knew the truth. The footsteps grew closer. I ran back to the office, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I threw myself into the chair just as a figure appeared in the hallway outside. It was Dr. Cormier, carrying a box of old documents. She glanced at me through the office window, her expression neutral. Still on shift, I see. Good dedication. She continued past, heading toward the front entrance where Mrs. Vance was presumably waiting. I watched her go, noticed how she walked, measured, controlled, almost mechanical. When she passed the Victorian-era exhibit, the Duke turned his head to follow her progress, and she turned hers to acknowledge him. For just a moment, they looked at each other, then both resumed their proper positions, as if nothing had happened. Dr. Cormier wasn't just a historian. She was part of this, part of whatever dark mechanism kept the museum running, kept the figures bound, kept the horror contained. I logged the encounter in my book, my hand shaking so badly I could barely write. 12:45 a.m., round completed. All figures in position. No anomalies to report. The lie felt heavy on the page, but Sleeping Beauty's warning echoed in my mind. Don't let them know you understand. The rest of the night crawled past. I completed my rounds exactly as required, noting the small wrongness I saw in every exhibit. The Revolutionary War soldier still pointed his musket in the wrong direction. The plague doctor's shadow extended in a direction that didn't match the light source. The oracle's lips were slightly parted, as if she'd been speaking and had only just stopped. And the Duke now stood in his correct position, facing the door, but his expression had changed. There was something knowing in his painted eyes now, something that suggested he was aware I had learned the truth. At 6 a.m., when Mrs. Vance arrived, she reviewed my logbook with particular attention. A quiet night, she observed. Yes, I lied. No unusual occurrences? No protocol violations? None. She studied me for a long moment, and I fought to keep my expression neutral. Finally, she nodded. You're doing well, Jordan. Better than most. I think you might actually last in this position. As I left the museum that morning, I noticed something I had missed before. A cornerstone near the entrance, carved with the museum's dedication. Founded 1847 by Erasmus Ashford. May his works endure forever. Below it, in smaller letters, almost worn away by time and weather. And may those within find peace in their eternal service. Not peace in death, peace in service. I pulled out my phone and sent an email to the only address I could think of, the museum archives account that had sent me the newspaper article. I know what you are. I know what this place is. What do you need me to do? I hit send and walked to my car, the morning sun feeling somehow less warm than it should. My phone buzzed before I'd even left the parking lot. A single word reply. Wait. 3 more nights passed, and with each one, the museum revealed more of its terrible truth. On my 3rd night, I discovered that the executioner could move his axe. I found it slightly lowered from its resting position, the blade catching the light differently. When I approached the log to change, I saw fresh scratches on the platform beneath him, long gouges in wood that could only have been made by repeated attempts to step down. On my 4th night, the plague doctor's shadow detached entirely from his body for almost 3 full minutes. I watched on the monitor as it stretched across the floor, reached toward the doorway, then snapped back into place as if yanked by an invisible chain. On my 5th night, the oracle spoke. Not whispers, not the plural voices that came from Sleeping Beauty's display, but a clear, singular voice that echoed through ancient civilizations as I passed. The child comes. The pattern completes. The wheel turns to 13. I froze, remembering the protocols. I wasn't supposed to turn my back on the oracle for more than 30 seconds, but nothing said I couldn't listen. 3 more nights, she continued, her voice hollow and ancient. Then the alignment, then the choice. The living custodian who carries death's key. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the protocols were clear. I completed my round in silence, logged the incident as ambient sounds, possibly ventilation, and tried not to think about what 3 more nights meant. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, because 3 more nights would be my 8th shift, and 8 was significant. 8 nights to mirror the 8 figures in the exhibits that seemed most active. 8 witnesses to whatever was supposed to happen. During those days between shifts, I researched Erasmus Ashford obsessively. What I found was fragmentary but deeply disturbing. Erasmus Ashford had been a mortician and wax sculptor who became obsessed with preserving not just the appearance of the dead, but their essence. He believed that memory, personality, consciousness itself could be captured and fixed in physical form through the right combination of materials and rituals. His museum opened in 1847 with 12 figures, each one supposedly depicting a famous historical person. But contemporary accounts mentioned something strange. Visitors reported feeling watched, experiencing unexplained cold spots, and hearing sound that had no source. By 1850, 2 night watchmen had died under mysterious circumstances. The museum closed briefly for renovations, And when it reopened, there were new protocols for night staff, rules that had to be followed exactly. The historical records showed the museum had nearly closed dozens of times over the decades. Financial troubles, mysterious deaths, investigations by local authorities. But it always survived, always found new funding, always continued operating. And always, there were figures and exhibits. Some were damaged in fires or accidents and had to be restored. Others were moved to storage or acquired from other collections. But a core group remained, the original 12. The Duke, Sleeping Beauty, the Executioner, the Oracle, the ones who moved most. On my 6th night, Mrs. Vance met me in the office with unusual intensity. "I need to ask you something, Jordan, and I need you to answer honestly." Her silver hair seemed to glow in the office lighting. "Have you noticed anything unusual during your shifts?" The question was a trap. I could feel it. Answer yes, and she'd know I'd learned too much. Answer no, and she'd know I was lying. "The figures are remarkably lifelike," I said carefully. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary." "That's not what I asked." We stared at each other across the desk, the monitors cycling through their camera feeds behind her. On one screen, I could see the Duke, perfectly positioned, facing his door. On another, Sleeping Beauty in her eternal rest. "The museum has a presence," I finally said. "You feel it more at night, like the building itself is alive." Mrs. Vance's expression shifted slightly. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something more complex. "The building is old. Old places of character." "Is that what you call it? Character?" "I call it history," she replied. "This museum preserves something important. Something that can't be allowed to end. Even if that something wants to end, even if it's in pain." Her face hardened. "You've been reading the archives. Or someone has been sharing them with you." I didn't respond, but I didn't need to. She could see the answer in my eyes. "The figures are artistic masterpieces," she said firmly. "They represent a lost art form. The protocols exist to protect them from damage, from environmental changes, from careless handling. Nothing more. And the whispers? Acoustics. Old buildings create strange sounds. And the warmth? The heartbeats. Your imagination, spurred by working alone at night in an unusual environment." She stood, gathering her things with sharp, angry movements. "I'm going to give you some advice, Jordan. The previous custodian, the one who broke protocol, he started asking questions too. He started trying to understand. That's what got him in trouble." "What happened to him?" Mrs. Vance paused at the door. "He's still here. In a way, the museum always finds use for those who serve it well." She glanced back at me. "Think carefully about where your loyalty lies. Some truths are better left unexamined." After she left, I sat in the silence of the office, the weight of her implications settling over me. The previous custodian was still here. Which figure had he become? Which platform now held to preserve consciousness? At 11 p.m., I began my round with new eyes. I looked at each figure not as art, but as a person. Tried to see past historical costumes and idealized features to the individual trapped beneath. The Revolutionary War soldier with his fearful determination. The Victorian lady with her painted smile that didn't reach her eyes. The medieval courtier whose expression suggested he was screaming silently. How many people have been consumed by this place? How many consciousnesses have been bound into wax and ritual, forced to serve as eternal exhibits? When I reached the Renaissance Gallery, I stopped before Sleeping Beauty's platform. Midnight was still an hour away, but I needed to try something. "I'm going to help you," I whispered, barely audible. "I don't know how yet, but I will." For just a moment, so brief I might have imagined it, her fingers twitched. The rest of the night passed in tense anticipation. Midnight came with its whispers, multiple voices overlapping in desperate pleas. I followed protocol, didn't respond, didn't approach until 12:30 a.m. But I listened. I tried to distinguish individual voices, to understand what they were saying. One voice rose above the others, clearer than before. "2 more nights. The museum will test you. Don't break. Don't bend. Follow the pattern exactly." At 2 a.m., During my round, I found the Duke facing the wrong direction again. This time, he wasn't just turned inward toward the exhibit. He was facing directly toward me, his painted eyes locked on mine with unmistakable intent. I approached as protocol demanded, ready to turn him back to face the door. As my hands touched his shoulders, his mouth moved. Not much, just a subtle shift of wax lips, but enough to form words I could barely hear. "The clock," he breathed. "Listen to the clock." I adjusted him quickly, my hand shaking, and retreated to log the incident. On the grandfather clock in the main hall, the time showed 2:13 a.m. The pattern was becoming clear. Sleeping Beauty had mentioned the 13th chime. The oracle had prophesied about 13. Now the Duke had spoken at 2:13. 13, the number beyond completion, the hour that shouldn't exist. My seventh night arrived with a sense of mounting inevitability. I'd stopped pretending this was a normal job. I'd stopped trying to rationalize what was happening. The museum was a prison, and I was somehow the key to either reinforcing those chains or breaking them. Mrs. Vance didn't appear that night. Instead, Dr. Cormier met me at the entrance, her expression grave. "Mrs. Vance is indisposed," she said. "I'll be supervising tonight. I trust that won't be a problem." "Of course not." She walked me to the office, but didn't leave immediately. Instead, she opened a drawer I'd never explored and removed a very old book, leather-bound and locked with a brass clasp. "This is Erasmus Ashford journal," she said. "His instructions for creating the exhibits, his theories on preservation and consciousness, his documentation of the rituals required to bind essence into form." She set it on the desk between us. "You've been curious about the museum's history. Here it is. Why are you showing me this? Because tomorrow is your 8th night, and on the 8th night you'll need to make a choice." Dr. Cormier's expression was impossible to read. Read the journal. Understand what Ashford created. Then decide if you want to help preserve it or destroy it. And if I choose to destroy it, then you'll learn what happens when protocols are truly broken. She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you choose preservation. The museum has stood for nearly 2 centuries. It represents something unique in human achievement, even if that achievement is morally questionable." "It's not achievement," I said quietly. "It's torture." "Is it?" she challenged. "The figures exist beyond death. They are immortal in their way. Erasmus believed he was granting eternal life. Who are we to say he was wrong?" After she left, I opened the journal. What I read made me sick. Erasmus Ashford had perfected a technique that combined wax sculpting with alchemical processes and ritual magic. He would select individuals, sometimes willing, sometimes not, and through a process he called essential distillation, he would extract their consciousness and bind it to a wax figure created with their own physical remains. The process was agonizing. The journal described screams that lasted for hours, convulsions, pleas for death. But Ashford believed he was creating art that would transcend time, preserving not just the appearance but the actual essence of the subjects. The 12 original figures were all people he knew. The Duke was his wealthy patron, who'd funded the museum with the understanding he would be preserved within it. Sleeping Beauty was Ashford's own daughter, who'd fallen ill and whom he refused to let die naturally. The executioner was a murderer Ashford had obtained from the local prison, believing violent essence would deter those who might try to damage the exhibits. Each figure represented a person who'd been systematically consumed by Ashford's vision of eternal art. The protocols weren't arbitrary. They were specific magical constraints designed to limit how much consciousness the figures could express. Never turn your back meant the binding weakened if they were unobserved. The Duke facing the door was a directional constraint, limiting his awareness to a specific orientation. The whispers after midnight were when the bindings naturally weakened during the liminal hour between night and morning, and the 13th chime was a failsafe Ashford had built into the museum itself. If the clock ever struck 13, all bindings would break simultaneously. The figures would be free to move, to act, to potentially escape, but only for as long as the 13th hour lasted. In practice, that hour never came. The clock was enchanted to never reach 13. It would chime 12 and reset, The 13th hour was theoretically possible, but practically impossible. Unless someone understood how to break the clock's enchantment, unless someone was willing to risk it. I closed the journal with trembling hands. My phone buzzed, an email from the archive account. Tomorrow night, if you follow every protocol perfectly for all 8 nights, you can choose. At midnight, stand before the grandfather clock. If you are worthy, you will understand. Choose. Dr. Cormier had used that word too, as if my decision actually mattered, as if I had any real power in this situation. At midnight, the whispers began. But tonight they were different, unified, almost choral. One more night, one more perfect night. Then the question comes. Then you decide who we are, living or dead, trapped or free. Remember us. Remember we were people. Remember we didn't choose this. I completed my rounds mechanically, noting every deviation from the norm, following every protocol exactly. The Duke turned twice. The executioner's axe lowered fully. The oracle spoke prophecies I didn't understand. Sleeping Beauty sat up again, but this time said nothing, just watched me with those 2 real eyes as I passed. At 6 a.m., Dr. Cormier returned. She checked the logbook with intense scrutiny. Perfect, she murmured. 7 perfect nights. Tomorrow will be interesting. What happens tomorrow? I asked. She smiled, and for the first time, I saw a genuine emotion in her expression. Sadness, maybe, or regret. Tomorrow, you discover whether you're a custodian or a liberator, whether you'll maintain what Erasmus built or tear it down. And you? What do you want? I want what I've always wanted, she said softly, to understand. I've studied this museum for 20 years, Jordan. I've read every document, traced every ritual, mapped every binding. I know how Erasmus did this. I know why it works. What I don't know is whether it should continue. You could stop it yourself. I pointed out. You know how. No, she shook her head. I'm compromised. I'm part of the system now. It has to be someone outside, someone new, someone who hasn't been assimilated into museum's nature. She looked at me intently. It has to be someone who still has a choice. She left me with those words, and I drove home in the early morning light, my mind racing. 1 more night, 8 nights total, each one following the protocols perfectly. And then, what? A test? A choice? The possibility of the 13th chime? I thought about the figures. The Duke who'd been a patron, Sleeping Beauty who'd been a daughter, the soldier who'd been a frightened young man. I thought about their consciousnesses trapped in wax prisons for nearly 2 centuries, aware but helpless, existing in a state between life and death. I thought about Mrs. Vance's warning that the previous custodian was still here. I looked at my own reflection in the rear-view mirror and wondered if that's what waited for me if I made the wrong choice. But then I thought about Sleeping Beauty's whispered plea, about the unified voices begging to be remembered as people, about the desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone would choose their freedom over the museum's preservation. That night, I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed of wax figures moving through dark halls, their mouths forming words I couldn't hear, their eyes pleading for something I didn't understand. Tomorrow would be my 8th night. The pattern would complete. The choice would come. I just had to decide if I was brave enough or foolish enough to let the clock strike 13. The 8th night arrived under a starless sky. Storm clouds had gathered throughout the day, turning evening into premature darkness. As I drove to the Ashford Museum, lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the Victorian building in brief, ghostly flashes. I arrived early, 9:30 p.m., instead of my usual 9:45. The parking lot was empty except for a single car I didn't recognize, an old sedan with rust along the wheel wells. The museum loomed before me, its windows dark except for the dim glow of emergency lighting within. The employee entrance was unlocked, which was unusual. I stepped inside and immediately knew something was different about tonight. The air felt charged, electric, as if the storm outside had somehow penetrated the building's walls. The usual sterile smell of climate control was overlaid with something older, incense maybe, or decay, or the particular scent of old paper burning. The office was empty. No Mrs. Vance, no Dr. Cormier. Just the monitors cycling to their feeds and a note on the desk in handwriting I didn't recognize. Jordan, tonight you walk alone. All protocols must be followed exactly. At midnight, you will understand. Should you choose preservation, call this number and we will guide you in the binding ritual. Should you choose liberation, may you forgive yourself for what comes after. Yea. Yea, Erasmus Ashford. But that was impossible. He died in 1876, according to the records I've found. Unless he hadn't died at all. Unless he'd used his own techniques on himself, becoming another figure in his museum, another consciousness bound to wax and protocol. Perhaps I've been walking past him every night, not recognizing the creator among his creations. I pocketed the note and checked the monitors. Every exhibit appeared normal. The Duke faced his door. Sleeping Beauty lay in repose. The executioner stood with his axe. The oracle sat on her throne, all exactly as they should be. But I could feel the tension in the building, like a breath held too long, like a scream building in a closed throat. At 10 p.m., I began my first round. The Victorian-era greeted me with its usual elaborate display. Gas lamps, cobblestone streets, figures frozen in the minutiae of daily life. The Duke stood in position 3, facing the doors required. But tonight, his wax face held an expression I'd never seen before, something between hope and terror. I moved closer, checking the logbook entry requirements. As I approached, his lips moved slightly, forming soundless words I could read. Thank you. For what? For following the protocols? For considering their freedom? For being the first custodian and how long to actually see them as people rather than objects? I moved on, fighting the urge to respond. The Revolutionary War exhibit was agitated, if that word could apply to frozen figures. The soldier who'd moved before now stood at attention, his musket perfectly aligned, but his painted eyes tracked my movement across the room. In the medieval court, the executioner had changed. His axe was no longer resting against his shoulder, but gripped in both hands, blade pointed downward. The position was more threatening, more ready for action. Around his platform, the air felt colder, charged with old violence barely contained. I kept my back to him for less than 30 seconds, exactly as protocol demanded. As I turned away, I heard the faintest creak of leather, his costume moving, his grip tightening on the axe handle. The Renaissance gallery was both beautiful and horrible. Sleeping Beauty lay on her gilded bed, but tonight her chest rose and fell with visible breaths. Not the subtle movement I had noticed before, but clear, undeniable respiration. She was breathing like a living person, though her eyes remained closed. I checked my watch. 10:42 p.m. More than an hour until midnight. Until the whispers. Until whatever was supposed to happen. Ancient civilizations waited in its usual mystery. The oracle sat on her throne, but tonight her painted eyes seemed to track me with purpose. As I passed, she spoke. Not the hollow prophecy before, but clear words meant specifically for me. The 8th witness completes the circle. The pattern recognizes you. At midnight, the museum will ask its question. Your answer cannot be undone. What question? I whispered, breaking protocol for the first time in 8 nights. Whether we deserve to rest, she replied, her voice growing fainter. Whether consciousness, once preserved, can be released. Whether death is a mercy or a curse. Choose wisely, 8th witness. Choose true. I completed my round at 11:03 p.m., logging everything with meticulous detail. The logbook had become a kind of talisman for me. Proof that I followed every rule, evidence that I'd earned whatever choice was coming. The storm outside intensified. Rain lashed against the windows. Thunder rolled across the building, making the old structure groan and settle. On the monitors, lightning flashes created strange shadows that moved independent of their sources. At 11:30 p.m., I began my second round. This time, the changes were more dramatic. The Duke had turned completely around. He now faced away from the door, toward the interior of the exhibit, in direct violation of the most important protocol. I approached to correct him, my hands already reaching for his shoulders, when I realized something was different. There were words carved into his back, fresh marks in the wax, as if someone had used a blade to inscribe them. Follow the clock. The answer is in the mechanism. The 13th is not a number, but a threshold. I turned him back to face the door with shaking hands, logging the incident, trying to understand. The clock, the grandfather clock in the main hall, that's where I was supposed to go at midnight. That's where the choice would be presented. In the medieval court, the executioner had stepped down from his platform, not completely off, not breaking that cardinal rule. But one foot was on the floor, the other still on the platform's edge, as if he was caught mid-stride, frozen in the act of descending. His hooded face tilted toward me, and I could swear I heard breathing from within the fabric. Rough, angry breathing. Protocol said to radio Mrs. Vance if a figure left its platform, but there was no one to radio. I was alone with whatever happened next. I continued my round, feeling the museum waking around me. Not just the figures now, but the building itself. The walls seemed to pulse with some kind of awareness. The floor creaked in patterns that sounded almost like words. The air moved in ways that had nothing to do with ventilation. At 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes before midnight, I stood in the main hall before the grandfather clock. It was a magnificent piece, easily 8 feet tall, carved from dark wood that had aged in near black. The clock face showed traditional Roman numerals, but I noticed something I had missed before. There was space for a 13th hour, a small section of the face between 12 and I where another number could fit. The space was currently blank, but as I watched, shadows seemed to gather there, suggesting the shape of 13. The clock ticked forward. The sound was thunderous in the quiet museum, each second marking time with mechanical precision. 11:56. Around me, I could hear movement. Soft footsteps, whispers of fabric, the creak of wax joints moving. The figures were leaving their platforms, breaking their constraints, drawn by the approaching threshold. 11:57. I pulled out my phone, looking at the note with its phone number. One call, and I could choose preservation. I could help maintain the bindings, keep the museum operating, ensure that Erasmus Ashford's vision continued. Dr. Cormier had said it represented something unique in human achievement, immortality of a sort, consciousness beyond death. 11:58. But I thought about Sleeping Beauty, Ashford's daughter, who'd been given eternal life without being asked if she wanted it. I thought about the Duke, a wealthy patron who'd funded his own prison. I thought about the soldier, the executioner, the oracle, all the consciousnesses trapped in wax and ritual, aware but helpless for nearly 200 years. 11:59. The figures were all around me now. I could see them in my peripheral vision. The Duke to my left, Sleeping Beauty to my right, the executioner behind me, the oracle approaching from ancient civilizations. Others too, figures from exhibits I'd barely noticed, all converging on a main hall, drawn to this moment. The clock's internal mechanism whirred, preparing for the midnight chime. And I understood. The choice wasn't about preservation versus destruction. It was about whether I believed consciousness deserved rest, whether awareness could be a curse rather than a blessing, whether immortality imposed was better than the natural end of death. Erasmus Ashford had tried to conquer death by binding essence to form, but he created something worse, an existence of perpetual awareness without agency, memory without action, identity without autonomy. His figures weren't immortal. They were trapped in a state that was neither life nor death, suffering in ways the living couldn't imagine. The clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The figures moved closer, forming a circle around me. I could see their faces now, see the humanity that the wax and paint couldn't quite hide, the fear, the hope, the desperate longing for an end to their preservation. 4, 5, 6. Sleeping Beauty reached out, her wax hand taking mine. It was warm, almost feverishly so, and I could feel a pulse in her wrist. She was alive, in some terrible way. They all were. 7, 8, 9. Choose, she whispered. Please, we've waited so long. 10, 11, 12. The clock's mechanism should have stopped there, should have reset. But something had changed, 8 nights of perfect protocol had weakened the enchantment, had created a gap in the bindings. The gears continued to turn. I made my choice. I reached forward and opened the clock's face, exposing the mechanism inside. There, among the gears and weights, I saw it. A small wax figure, barely 6 inches tall, hidden in the clock's heart. Erasmus Ashford himself, bound into the very mechanism that controlled the museum's magic. I grabbed the figure and pulled it free. The clock chimed the 13th time. The sound was wrong, deeper than the other chimes, resonant with a frequency that made my teeth ache. It echoed through the museum, through the figures, through the building itself. The lights flickered, the floor trembled, and the bindings broke. Sleeping Beauty gasped, a real gasp, air drawn into lungs that had been paralyzed for centuries. Her grip on my hand tightened, became human rather than merely warm. Color flooded her wax face, turning it from artificial to real. Around me, all the figures were transforming. Wax became flesh. Paint became living skin. Stillness became motion. They were reversing, unwinding from the preserved state back to their original forms. But they were also dying, because the bodies they'd been bound to were long dead. The transformation was giving them back their humanity, but humanity meant mortality. They had seconds, maybe minutes, before the reality of their physical death caught up with the return of their consciousness. The Duke collapsed first, his aged body unable to sustain itself after so long in stasis. He fell to the marble floor with a sound that was painfully human. But he was smiling, actually smiling, as life and death rushed back into him simultaneously. "Thank you," he whispered with his last breath. "Thank you for letting us end." Around the hall, the other figures were falling too. The Revolutionary War soldier crumpled, his young face peaceful as death claimed him properly this time. The executioner removed his hood, revealing the face of a middle-aged man who'd carried his guilt for far too long, and simply stopped breathing, relieved. Sleeping Beauty held my hand through her transformation. I watched as her preserved form became mortal, watched as she lived for perhaps 10 seconds as a true human being before her illness, the one that had killed her 200 years ago, reasserted itself. "Tell them," she said with her final breath. "Tell them we didn't want to live forever. Tell them we just wanted peace." She died in my arms, her body becoming heavy in a way wax never was. Real flesh, real bone, real death. The oracle was the last. She'd risen from her throne and walked to where I stood, her ancient form becoming elderly human before my eyes. She touched my face with one aged hand, her eyes clearing from painted symbols to human awareness. "You chose mercy," she said. "That is good. That is right. But know this, there are other museums, other places where Ashford's techniques were learned and practiced, other consciousnesses trapped in preservation." She swayed, her strength failing. "Find them. Free them. Let us not be the only ones who found rest." Then she too collapsed, her body settling into final stillness. I stood alone in a museum that had become a tomb. Bodies lay around me. All the figures, all the bound consciousnesses, finally released into death. The building groaned as its magical infrastructure collapsed without the enchantments to sustain it. In my hand, I still held the small wax figure of Erasmus Ashford. As I watched, it began to crack, to crumble, turning to dust between my fingers. His final binding, released with all the others. The storm outside had stopped. Through the high windows, I could see the first suggestion of dawn. My shift was ending one way or another. I pulled out my phone and called 911. "I need help," I said when the operator answered. "I'm at the Ashford Historical Wax Museum. There's been a collapse. Please send someone." What I didn't tell them was that the collapse wasn't structural. It was ontological. The museum had been held together by magic and suffering, and with both of those ended, it was simply ceasing to exist. As I waited for emergency services, I walked through the exhibits one last time. The platform stood empty now, the careful lighting illuminating nothing but dust and the faint outlines where figures had stood for nearly 2 centuries. On the walls, the plaques that had described each exhibit were fading, the words becoming illegible as the museum's history unmade itself. In the Renaissance gallery, Sleeping Beauty's gilded bed remained, but it was different now. Instead of display of preserved perfection, it was simply a bed where a young woman had died 200 years ago, then been forced to live again, then finally been allowed to rest. I found a blanket in the office and covered her body with it. Then I did the same for the others. The Duke, the soldier, the executioner, the oracle. All the figures who become people again, if only for a moment. All the consciousnesses who'd chosen death over preservation. When the police arrived, followed by paramedics and eventually city officials, I told them a partial truth. I said I found the bodies during my shift, that they appeared to have been hidden in the museum for years, possibly decades. I said nothing about wax figures or magical bindings or choices made at midnight. Mrs. Vance never appeared. Neither did Dr. Cormier. When authorities searched for them, they found no employment records, no addresses, no evidence they existed at all. Like the museum itself, they'd been part of the enchantment. And when the enchantment ended, so did they? The museum was condemned within days. Investigators determined that the building was structurally unsound, that it had been maintained through irregular means, and that it posed a danger to public safety. Within a month, it was demolished. I stood across the street the day the wrecking balls came, watching as the Victorian building crumbled. As the walls came down, I could have sworn I saw shapes in the dust. Figures dancing, finally free, finally at peace. The bodies I had found were identified eventually. DNA analysis, historical records, and old missing persons cases converged to reveal that the figures had been real people, preserved through unknown means. The case made national news briefly. Victorian-era preservation scandal uncovered, but faded as other stories took precedence. No one ever figured out how Erasmus Ashford had done it. The journal disappeared from the office before authorities arrived, taken by some final magical failsafe, or perhaps by Dr. Cormier before she vanished. All that remained was speculation and mystery and a plot of land where an old museum once stood. I left that job, of course. Found work at a normal gallery with normal art and normal security concerns. But the oracle's final words haunted me. Other museums, other trapped consciousnesses, other people suffering in preservation. I began to research carefully and quietly. I looked for museums with unusual protocols, with night shift jobs that couldn't keep custodians, with whispered rumors of figures that moved when no one watched. And I found them, not many, but enough, scattered across the country, hidden in plain sight, preserved collections that were more than they seemed. This is my purpose now, my calling, if you want to call it that. I find the places where consciousness has been bound to form, where people have been preserved beyond their deaths, where mercy has been denied in the name of immortality. And when I find them, I make a choice. The same choice I made that 8th night at the Ashford Museum. I let the clock strike 13. I set them free. 6 months after the Ashford Museum fell, I walked into the Bellingham Institute of Historical Preservation in Portland, Oregon, carrying a resume and a cover letter that emphasized my experience with sensitive historical collections. The job posting had been carefully worded, almost identical to the one that had led me to Ashford, and I'd recognized the patterns immediately. Night curator needed. Must be comfortable with solitary work. Excellent attention to detail required. Familiarity with preservation protocols essential. Competitive salary. The interview was conducted by a man named Mr. Reeves, elderly and sharp-eyed, who asked strange questions about my comfort level with unpredictable preservation environments, and whether I believe historical artifacts could possess more than mere educational value. I answered carefully, giving him exactly what he wanted to hear, without revealing what I knew. Yes, I was comfortable working alone. Yes, I understood that some collections required specific handling. Yes, I believed historical artifacts deserve respect and proper care. He hired me on the spot. The Bellingham Institute houses one of the most significant collections of clockwork automata in North America. Mr. Reeves explained as he led me through the museum. Many of these pieces date back to the 18th century. They're extraordinarily delicate and valuable. We walked through galleries filled with mechanical figures, dancers frozen mid-pirouette, musicians with instruments raised, soldiers in various poses of attention, all crafted with exquisite detail, all mounted on platforms with small brass keys inserted in their backs. The preservation conditions are very specific, Mr. Reeves continued, handing me a sheet of protocols. The automata must never be wound. They are too fragile for operation. The environmental controls must remain at precise temperature and humidity levels. And most importantly, he paused, his gaze sharpening. If you hear any of them ticking, you must report it immediately. I scanned the protocol sheet. It was longer than Ashford's had been, more detailed, but the underlying structure was familiar. Rules designed to limit awareness. Constraints to prevent the bound consciousnesses from expressing themselves fully. Rule 8 caught my attention. If the conductor, Gallery 3's centerpiece, raises his baton, wind him counterclockwise exactly 3 times and notify management immediately. The conductor, like Ashford's Duke, a central figure that requires specific attention. I understand, I said, folding the protocols carefully. When do I start? Tonight, if you're available. Our previous night curator left rather suddenly. Of course he did. That first night, I walked to the Bellingham Institute with practiced caution, noting every detail. The automata were beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. Too lifelike, too detailed, created with the same obsessive precision I'd seen at Ashford. The conductor stood in the center of Gallery 3, a figure of a man in an elegant tuxedo, his right arm raised to hold a baton, his left positioned as if preparing to cue an orchestra. His face was painted with incredible realism, and his glass eyes seemed to follow me as I passed. Around him, other automata were arranged as if forming an orchestra, a violinist, a cellist, a pianist, a dozen others, all frozen the moment before performance, all with keys in their backs, all utterly still, but I could hear them breathing. Not loud, not obvious, but if you stayed quiet, if you listened carefully, you could hear the subtle sounds of air moving through mechanical lungs, of clockwork hearts maintaining rhythm, of consciousness trapped in metal and springs. I thought of Sleeping Beauty and her gilded bed, of the Duke facing his door, of all the figures who'd suffered at Ashford, waiting for someone to set them free. These automata were no different, just a different technique, a different binding, but the same terrible result. People preserved beyond death, awareness without agency, immortality as imprisonment. I spent that first week learning the museum's patterns, following the protocols exactly, building trust with Mr. Reeves and the day staff. I discovered that the Bellingham Institute had been founded in 1812 by a clockmaker named Heinrich Bellingham, who'd been obsessed with creating eternal performance, automata that would never wind down, never stop, never die. He'd succeeded in his way. But like Erasmus Ashford, he'd done it by binding human consciousness to mechanical form. Each automaton housed someone who'd agreed to eternal performance or had been tricked into it, their essence captured and fixed in clockwork and brass. The conductor had been Bellingham himself, preserving his own consciousness to lead his eternal orchestra. The other automata were performers he'd known, students he'd taught, people he convinced that immortal art was worth any price. On my 8th night, because it was always the 8th night, always a completion pattern, I stood before the conductor at midnight and made my choice. I reached forward and wound his key, not counterclockwise, as the protocols demanded, but clockwise, the forbidden direction, the activation. His mechanism engaged with a sound like a sigh of relief. The baton began to lower, then rise again in the preparation for a downbeat. His head turned, his glass eyes focusing on me with sudden awareness. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice emerging from mechanical larynx and leather lungs. At last, he raised his baton fully and brought it down in a sharp motion. Throughout Gallery 3, every automaton activated simultaneously. The bindings broke as clockwork mechanisms engaged for the first time in decades or centuries. The violinist drew her bow across strings, producing a single perfect note. The pianist's fingers touched keys, creating melody. The cellist, the flutist, the percussionist, all began to play. It was the most beautiful and terrible music I'd ever heard. Each note was perfect because these weren't merely mechanical reproductions. These were human consciousnesses expressing themselves through mechanical means, pouring all their trapped awareness into one final performance. The concert lasted exactly 13 minutes. As the music built to its crescendo, I saw the transformation begin. The automata's mechanical bodies began to corrode, to rust, to decay at an accelerated rate. The bindings that had preserved them were releasing, and without those bindings, time caught up instantly. The conductor played through his dissolution, his baton keeping perfect time even as his mechanical joint seized and his brass frame tarnished. The orchestra followed his lead, each performer playing until their instruments could no longer function, until their mechanisms wound down for the final time. The last note faded into silence. The conductor lowered his baton slowly, his head turning toward me one more time. "Tell them," he said, his voice faltering as his mechanism failed, "that we play for love of music, not for eternity. Tell them we just wanted to rest." Then he was still, truly still, not the frozen stillness of preservation, but the genuine stillness of ended life. Around him, the orchestra had stopped as well. Their mechanical bodies collapsed into poses of final rest. I stood in the sudden quiet, surrounded by automata that were now simply machines, clockwork and metal, absent the consciousness that had animated them. The gallery felt lighter somehow, as if an enormous pressure had been released. By morning, the museum was in chaos. The entire automaton collection had catastrophically deteriorated overnight, according to preliminary assessment. Investigators searched for environmental failures, sabotage, anything that could explain the simultaneous breakdown of dozens of priceless artifacts. They never found an explanation. Mr. Reeves disappeared, much like Mrs. Vance had, leaving no trace beyond employment records that seemed to grow vaguer the more authorities examined them. The Bellingham Institute closed permanently within 3 months. The building was eventually converted to condominiums, and if any of the residents hear echoes of music late at night, they attribute it to old pipes or distant traffic. I moved on. Over the next year, I found and freed 4 more collections. A porcelain figurine museum in Charleston, where consciousness had been bound into ceramics through kilns that burned at magical temperatures. A photography exhibit in Boston, where people's essences have been trapped into daguerreotypes through chemical processes that went beyond science. A sculpture garden in New Mexico, where bodies have been literally encased in bronze and left to endure the elements while fully aware. Each location had its own protocols, its own carefully constructed bindings, its own trapped consciousness. But the pattern was always the same. The 8th night, the choice, the freedom that came to cost of final death. I developed a reputation, though I didn't intend to. People in certain circles began to whisper about a curator who specialized in resolving troubled collections. Museums with unusual staff retention problems would sometimes receive my anonymous resume. Collectors with heirloom pieces that seemed too lifelike would find my contact information slipped into their correspondence. Some of them wanted me to preserve what they had, to maintain the bindings, to continue the immortality. I always declined. I'd seen too much suffering disguised as achievement, too much torture presented as art. Whatever Erasmus Ashford and others like him had believed about eternal consciousness, I knew the truth. Awareness without autonomy wasn't immortality. It was hell. But some of them, the brave ones or the guilty ones, or simply the ones who'd finally recognized the horror of what they possessed, wanted me to do what I'd done before, to find the binding, break it, and let the trapped consciousness finally rest. Those were the jobs I took. I became skilled at recognizing signs. The too perfect craftsmanship that suggests a human remains were incorporated. The strange warmth of materials that should be cold. The sense of being watched by objects that had no eyes. The protocols that seemed arbitrary, but were actually magical constraints. And I became skilled at breaking them. Finding the central binding, the clock mechanism, the musical key, the chemical solution, whatever anchor held a consciousness in place, and disrupting it at the moment when disruption was possible. Always the 8th night, always midnight, always the 13th hour that shouldn't exist, but could be created through perfect adherence to the very protocols designed to prevent it. The pattern was elegant in its way, a kind of magical logic that made sense once you understood it. The bindings required precision to maintain, but perfect precision created gaps, moments when the enchantment's rigidity became a vulnerability. Tonight, I stand in yet another museum, the Whitmore Collection of Medieval Effigies in Philadelphia, a small private museum housed in a converted church. The job posting appeared on the same obscure board where I found Ashford's listing all those months ago. Night watchman needed. Historical stone effigies. Must follow strict preservation protocols. Do not disturb the night. The night, always a central figure, always a specific warning. I've spent 7 nights here, learning the patterns. The effigies are stone carvings of medieval nobles, lying in repose on tomb pedestals as if sleeping. They date from the 14th century. Supposedly, though I recognize the technique now, not stone at all or not entirely. Some kind of alchemical process that turned flesh to stone, preserving consciousness in mineral form. The knight lies on the largest tomb, his stone hands folded over the hilt of a carved sword. His face is peaceful but alert, as if he's listening to something only he can hear. According to protocols, his sword must always point toward the chapel's altar. If it shifts, it must be corrected immediately. Tonight is the 8th night. I followed every protocol perfectly, earned the pattern's recognition. Now I stand before the knight's tomb at 11:58 p.m., my hands resting on the cold stone of his sword. The chapel is silent except for the wind outside and the distant sound of traffic. No clock here to strike 13, but I've learned that the 13th hour isn't about actual timekeeping. It's about threshold moments, liminal spaces where the bindings thin. I grip the knight's stone sword and turn it, not toward the altar, but away from it, the forbidden direction, the breaking of the central protocol. The stone groans. Throughout the chapel, the other effigies begin to crack, thin lines spreading across stone surfaces like veins or lightning. Light leaks through the cracks. Not natural light, but the luminescence of trapped energy finally being released. The knight's eyes open, real eyes behind stone lids, brown and human and filled with awareness that's endured for 700 years. "You heard us," he says, his voice grinding like stone on stone. "Across the centuries, you heard us calling." "I hear all of you," I reply, everyone trapped by someone else's vision of eternity. "Then free us, please. We've stood watch for so long." I step back as the transformation begins. The stone effigies are cracking apart, revealing the desiccated bodies within, medieval nobles preserved through alchemy. Their consciousness is bound to stone tombs, and some scholars attempt to create eternal monuments. They emerge like butterflies from chrysalises. But they're not beautiful. They're ancient and withered, bodies that should have decomposed 700 years ago, finally experiencing the death that was denied them. The knight stands, his stone form falling away to reveal the old man beneath, a crusader who'd been promised eternal honor, who'd received eternal imprisonment instead. He looks at me with gratitude that breaks my heart. "We tried to send warning," he says, his voice now human and fading, "to all who came after. Carved into stone, written in protocols, whispered from bindings. Do not preserve. We tried to say, do not trap consciousness. Let death be death." "I understand," I tell him. "I'll make sure the message continues." He nods, satisfied, and collapses. Around the chapel, the other nobles are falling too, their ancient bodies finally allowed to complete the cycle that should have ended centuries ago. As dawn breaks through the church's stained glass windows, I stand among the remains and make my call to authorities. Another mysterious discovery, another historical mystery. Let them puzzle over it. Let them wonder how the effigies contained actual bodies, how the preservation was maintained for so long. I'll be gone before they arrive, already searching for the next location, already looking for the next museum where protocols hint at trapped consciousness, where historical artifacts are more than they seem. Because the Oracle was right. There are others, many others, scattered across the country and probably across the world. Collections created by people who believed immortality was worth any price, who thought eternal preservation was a gift rather than a curse. My phone buzzes with an email from an anonymous sender. Another job posting. Another museum with strange protocols and staff that never lasts. The Harrington Gallery of Life Masks. Denver, Colorado. Night curator needed. Did not touch the poet's face. Familiarity with preservation ethics required. The poet. Another central figure. Another specific warning. Another consciousness trapped in someone else's idea of eternal art. I book a flight for tonight. This is my work now. My purpose. I am the curator who breaks preservation, the watchman who releases the watched. I stand at midnight in museums across America, finding the bindings that trap awareness and breaking them with precision and mercy. Some might call it destruction. I call it liberation. Because I learned the truth during my 8 nights at Ashford, during all the nights that followed. Immortality imposed is torture. Consciousness preserved without consent is imprisonment. And death, natural death, is not an enemy to be conquered, but a mercy to be granted. The figures taught me that. Sleeping Beauty and the Duke, the conductor in the night, all the consciousness trapped in wax and clockwork and stone and 100 other forms. They taught me that awareness is precious, but so is rest. That memory matters, but so does ending. That we honor the dead not by preserving them forever, but by letting them go. So I travel from museum to museum, from collection to collection, following the pattern that reveals the bindings. 8 perfect nights. Midnight of the 8th. The choice that breaks the enchantment. And every time I free another trapped consciousness, every time I watch them experience their final moments of true humanity before natural death claims them at last, I hear Sleeping Beauty's last words. Tell them we didn't want to live forever. Tell them we just wanted peace. I'm telling them, through every binding I break, through every consciousness I free, through every museum I unmake, I'm telling the world that some horrors come dressed as achievement, that some prisons are built by people who believe they were offering gifts. And I'll keep telling them, keep freeing them, until every trapped consciousness has been given the choice Erasmus Ashford and others like him never offered. The choice to rest, the choice to end, the choice to be human, even if only for a moment, before embracing the death that should have come centuries ago. This is my work. This is my calling. I am Jordan Hayes, the curator of the 13th Hour, and I have so many more museums to free. The end.